Welcome back to the class video for Module 10, in which we're looking at the Federal Constitution. In the first part of class, we tried to set the Federal Convention in historical context by looking at the politics of the post-revolution or Confederation period. The main idea that you should take away from that context is to understand that the delegates who traveled to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to meet as a federal convention and draft the federal Constitution were in no way a kind of representative cross-sample of political opinion in America in the 1780s. Instead, they tended to share a perspective that put them in the minority of their state political cultures. That common perspective was that what they were witnessing in the laws being passed by these state governments was democracy run amok. They were witnessing the people drunk with freedom, if you will, and using their newfound power to violate the rights of property or the rights of contract. And they thought that they perceived in these laws this inevitable Aristotelian decline from the good phase of the rule of the many that we call democracy, and they thought they were watching the descent into the corrupt phase of the rule of the many, anarchy, or what we described as the Machiavellian moment. That view was not necessarily shared by the majority of people in America in the 1780s, who thought that what they were doing was securing the freedom of all those common people who had fought the war against British tyranny. Now, though the delegates to the Federal Convention tended to be of a common political persuasion, it did not mean that they agreed unanimously either on the causes of this corruption and definitely on the cures. What would be the appropriate fixes to stop this democracy run amok? And we'll see the details of at least one of those debates around the process for electing representatives to the House of Representatives and senators to the Senate next week in Module 11 when we look at Madison's notes on the convention debates. For our purposes here in Module 10, looking at the text of the original Constitution, we want to understand it as a kind of complicated mousetrap designed to contain the worst impulses of democracy. It's designed as a kind of restraint upon, a kind of mechanism for redirecting the corrupt energies of the people. And we will see in each of its key features how different it is than the state revolutionary constitutions that we looked at in Module 8. So let's take a similar approach here and look through each of the core components or pieces of the Constitution and see how they fit together. Now, you know that we're dealing with three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, each described in successive articles, Article 1, 2, and 3. But we also have to keep in mind that the legislative is bicameral, has both a House of Representatives and a Senate. So we're talking about three branches, but four core institutions, and keeping that 3 and 4 back and forth as we go through will be important. So let's turn now to the text, and we'll start with Article 1 and look at the basis of representation in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, their terms, and combined powers. If we begin with Article 1, Section 1, we find a minor but really significant difference between the grant of legislative powers in this Constitution and the Pennsylvania and New York Constitutions that we looked at in Module 8. Section 1 reads, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives." And we want to take note of the qualification on those legislative powers. It's all legislative powers herein granted, which is different than the language we saw in Pennsylvania and New York, which granted all sovereign powers of a legislature. That is to say, the state constitutions granted all conceivable powers that would belong to a legislature. The federal constitution only grants those legislative powers herein granted that is listed, and as we'll see, they're primarily listed in Article 1, Section 8. So we'll come back to that, but it's very important to hang on to that difference in the language describing the legislative powers. Now, obviously, the big idea here is to label the Congress as consisting of these two bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So let's look at Section 2 and how the members of the House of Representatives are going to be chosen. Section 2, Clause 1 reads, "The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature." So we're familiar with this pattern. Every 2 years we do national elections for representatives to the House of Representatives. Notice that that is twice as long as what was most common in the state constitutions. That is, especially for the popular house, the elections were held every year. So there's a doubling of the term here from 1 year to 2 year. Perhaps most significant, though, is that the federal constitution does not attempt to impose a federal standard for who gets to vote. The electors in each state, those are the voters in each state. And in just the two constitutions that we saw 3 different standards for who should get to vote. In Pennsylvania, it was anyone who had paid any public tax. In New York, for the popular house, it was anyone that owned their land, had a lower threshold, or rented their land for a slightly higher threshold. And then for the New York Senate, an even higher standard of having to own your land outright. That is the quantity of land that you had to own. And there were differences just like that in every single state constitution. So the Federal Convention avoided the issue of creating a national federal standard for voting and imposing it on the states, because of course that would have been enormously controversial and made the Constitution very difficult to get ratified. But the consequence of that is, even to this day, we cannot have a national, federal voting card and single elections on federal voting election days, and all the states are required to have their state offices and county offices on those federal election days. Instead, we have this crazy patchwork of 50 different states, each with its own voting standards and requirements and voting days and blah, 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 blah. And the reason that we can't have a national standard is because of the language here in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1. Now the meat of this section comes down in Clause 3, and this will be the primary clause that we'll be reading about next week in Module 11 in Madison's Notes on the Convention. We'll be reading the debates among the convention delegates on this clause, and then when we get to Article 3, Section 1, that is the basis of representation for the House and for the Senate. Section 2, Clause 3 reads, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." So this clause includes the infamous 3/5 phrase. 3/5 of all other persons obviously refers to slaves, and we'll see the debate about that explicitly in Module 11 when we read Madison's Notes. The conceptual heart of this clause, though, is in the first phrases. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, according to their respective numbers, and then this formula for how to determine those numbers. So this directive to add together all these people, and then it talks about the actual enumeration within 3 years and every subsequent term of 10 years, this is the constitutional mandate for us to perform the federal census every 10 years. Every 10 years, the Constitution directs that the federal government shall count up everybody that exists. Now, we do not use this the three-fifths formula, of course, anymore, but to count up everybody every 10 years and then to reapportion. And the conceptual key here is these two things shall be reapportioned, both representatives and direct taxes. Now, the idea of reapportioning representatives should be familiar to you. That is the primary outcome today of each federal census, is we redraw voting districts in response to shifts in population, pursuing the principle of each voter should have roughly equal voting power. And if you recall our example, if you have a voting district with 100 people in it that gets to elect one representative, and then you have a voting district with 1,000 people in it, and it also gets to elect one representative, the people in the district with only 100 people in it each have 10 times more voting power than the people who live in the district with 1,000 people in it. So in order to redress that inequity, we count up everybody in the country every 10 years, and we redistribute the number of representatives to reflect shifts in population in order to sustain rough parity in voting power. Now, this, of course, is an enormously politically controversial thing every time it comes up. So every 10 years, we go through this cycle of arguing, and you may hear news stories about it. It's mandated by this constitutional clause. Now, the other half of this, though, is far less familiar to you, and there's no reason it should be. The original Constitution requires both that representatives get reapportioned, but also that taxes get reapportioned. So that, for example, if Virginia had 15% of all the people counted up in the census by whatever formula, Virginia should get 15% of all the representatives in the House of Representatives, and Virginia should only have to pay 15% of the national budget, so that the amount of property that Virginia has at stake is correlated with the amount of representation that it gets. Now, this should sound strange to you because this is no longer the primary way, at least, the federal government derives its tax revenue. As I'm sure you're familiar, by far the largest source of revenue into the federal government are federal income taxes. Well, this clause of the Constitution, which mandates direct taxes, by inference, prohibits individual income tax, because if you tax each individual, it may well result that Virginia, say, the people of Virginia end up paying a lot more in federal taxes than their proportion of the population, and hence the number of representatives they get. So this clause of the Constitution had been thought to prohibit an income tax until the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913, which gave a constitutional allowance to a federal income tax. So essentially, since the turn of the 20th century, since roughly 1913, the federal government no longer apportions its taxes as required by Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. Rather, they derive their income. It derives its income from individual income taxes. And that development of the income tax essentially broke the conceptual relationship between representation and direct taxes as it was intended in the original Constitution. The reason this is important is because we saw these two different principles at war with each other, or in competition with each other, about what does representation represent within the state constitutions. One idea is every person deserves to be represented equally because we are all equally citizens who have given our individual consent. But there's another idea, of course, that's reflected in the New York Constitution, that those people who possess, that the primary purpose of government is to protect property, and that those people who have more property have more at stake in governmental policy than those people who don't. So they deserve a representation of their property. So these two fundamental concepts about what representatives represent. One is personhood and one is property. And we'll see this explicit when we read the debates in the Federal Convention in the next module. What is critical to understand about the language of the final constitutional text is that it combines those two principles together. It says both representatives and direct taxes both get a portion by the formula, the number produced by the formula for the census. So these two conceptual principles that had been considered, think of John Adams's argument for the necessity of a bicameral legislature. On the one hand, the people at large do deserve to be represented, so they should get one house. Property and the natural aristocracy needs to have its own source of power so it can do good for society. So it should get its own house. So these two principles, personhood and property, in the revolutionary phase are understood to belong to distinct branches that should be set in opposition to each other. Here in the federal Constitution, they are combined together into one formula, both made contingent upon this number produced by the census. We'll see how this formula is a resolution to what seems like an intractable debate between those advocates for personhood, those advocates for property, and what debate that nearly blew up the Constitutional Convention. The way that they resolve that is through the formula that you see here. Now the Senate then represents an entirely different theory of representation. We'll turn to that in just a second, but there's one more critical feature of the House of Representatives that we need to note at the top of the right-hand column of 2. The number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative. Now that language is a little confusing as a math story problem, but it essentially sets a minimum number of voters in order to comprise a federal voting district. You must have at least 30,000 people in any one district to vote for someone in the House of Representatives. If your state doesn't have 30,000 people in it, then we're going to give you at least 1 representative. Now, the critical thing to understand about this is that in the context of 1787, 30,000 is an absolutely astronomical number. It is a tiny number by our contemporary 21st century standards. Federal voting districts for houses of representatives routinely are between, say, 400 and 500,000 people. We have long since exceeded this minimum that was set in the Constitution. But in 1787, Philadelphia is the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, and it has about 25,000 people in it. The vast majority of the American citizenry live rural lives and largely isolated rural lives. You're going to have to encompass a huge swath of physical land in order to include at least 30,000 voters to constitute a voting district. So we want to understand about the House of Representatives that conceptually it both combines personhood and property in its formula for how to distribute the representatives, but also that it imagines enormous voting districts as being the best form of voting for securing good politicians and office holders. That is, the wise and the virtuous are most likely to be elected if they're voted out of a very large district. We'll see that this conceptual kind of premise or assertion is foundational to Publius's writing in the Federalist Essays. He's going to reflect again and again on the advantages of what he'll call enlarging the sphere or expanding the sphere. And we're going to refer then, when we get to Publius, back to this clause in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, which sets a minimum number of voters for a federal voting district, and that number is very large. All right, so if we turn then to the Senate in Section 3, it's a much simpler matter. Section 3, Clause 1 reads, "The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote." And then Clause 2 establishes the rotation, right? So every 2 years, we elect 1/3 of senators who all serve for 6 years apiece. So notice that the selection of senators is not based on population or the census. It is not subject to being redistributed every 10 years based on the result of the census. Every state gets 2 senators. Each senator gets 1 vote. So the thing that is being represented in the Senate is not the people, but the states. The states are the things that are equal to each other. Now that, of course, was not a principle that we saw in either the Pennsylvania or the New York Constitution, but it was the voting principle of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation made the states equal as states, so the smallest and the poorest state had the same voting power as the biggest, most populated, and wealthiest state. And note, too, that the people do not choose their senators. The state chooses the senator. That is, they are chosen by the legislature thereof. Now, if that sounds curious to you, it's because that also is another feature of the original Constitution, which has subsequently been amended. The 16th Amendment, also passed in 1913, required every state to allow popular elections for the selection of their senators. All through the 19th century and in the Constitution's original conception, the senators would not be subject to popular elections. The people would choose their state legislatures, and then their state legislatures would choose their senators. So the senators are, in a sense, chosen by the state, right? They represent the state as a corporate body. So we want to notice these 2 contrasts then. In the state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation from the Revolutionary period, we saw these 3 different ideas about what representatives represent: personhood, property, or statehood, or the corporate entity of the state. And notice how those 3 principles that were distributed across those 2 levels, the national level and the state level, and perceived at the state level as being in conflict with each other, are here sort of crammed and shoehorned into 2 bodies within 1 branch. So whereas in the kind of Aristotelian scheme, they have to be broken out into separate branches because there is this fundamental animosity between them, right? Politics is about the conflict between the 3 different branches, their competition and their ambition, and that they represent sort of social cohorts, right? Classes in society. The conceptual genius of the federal draft here, of the federal model, is to take those things which had been distinct and in tension with each other and to combine them together here within 1 branch so that all those concepts are represented, but in a different formula. Now, it's not to say that that formula necessarily makes sense, and as we'll see when we get to the debates, not everybody agrees that this is coherent, but it's a kind of rejiggering of the pieces on the chessboard. It allows a restoration of checks and balances without a return to the old imperial monarchical model. It's a new way of thinking about how to divide and separate these things. So the first step is to combine what had been in opposition before to unite it as 1 force in this formula. Then we'll set it in opposition to the executive and the judicial branches. Before we turn there, though, let's look at the powers granted to Congress in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 is a kind of laundry list or bullet list, if you will, of powers granted to Congress. So, first clause, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes. 2, to borrow money. 3, to regulate commerce, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization, etc., etc., etc. Congress has the power to do these 17 things. And then this weird 18th clause, which is not like the others, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So a list of 17 things, and then an empowerment to do anything necessary and proper for carrying into execution one of those 17 things. This 18th clause is known as the necessary and proper clause, and if you don't like it, you call it the elastic clause, because the idea is it creates for those first 17 things, it creates elasticity, right, in what government authority might be exercised on behalf of those 17 things. That 18th clause then raises the critical conceptual paradox or interpretive problem with the idea of a constitution of enumerated powers. Going back to the very first section of this article, Congress is only granted only permitted those powers herein granted, right? So the pretense is we're creating a narrowly tailored government that won't have authority over very many things, only the things we've specifically spelled out. But then we add as this kind of boilerplate disclaimer language in tiny font at the bottom of the document, oh, but whatever they have to do in order to achieve those responsibilities we've just given them is fine by this 18th clause. You'll see that Melancton Smith makes much of this necessary and proper clause to dispute Madison's claim that this will be a government of limited powers, that it can only do those things that are spelled out and permitted for it to do in Article 1, Section 8. But we want to emphasize this contrast between the federal model of sovereignty and the state model of sovereignty. Those state constitutions granted their legislatures all the sovereign powers of a legislature. That is, every conceivable thing that you can imagine appropriate for a legislature to do, we bestow on our legislature to do. We call that plenary or original sovereignty, or the exercise of police powers. Those are all key constitutional phrases to describe the doctrine, roughly, of states' rights. The contrary interpretation, or the contrary form of sovereignty, is the doctrine of enumerated powers or delegated powers, as we see here in the federal Constitution. The notion there is the government starts with zero power, and it can only act when it's pursuing one of these 17 things. If there's any ambiguity about whether the government has power or not, the default interpretation should be, nope, it doesn't, unless you can show me an explicit clause in the language of the Constitution allowing it to do that thing. It should not be allowed to do it. Now, that's the theory of interpretation, but that theory of interpretation is undermined when you come to this necessary and proper clause. That's the safety valve rationale out for the exercise of federal authority. And that's a very controversial part of the doctrine of enumerated powers. Okay, let's turn now to the executive branch and the election of the president and see the most convoluted, complicated, and ambiguous paragraph of the entire Constitution. We'll turn to the executive now. All right, Article 2 describes the executive power, and we're familiar with the Section 1, Clause 1's description of the office of the president and its 4-year term. Perhaps no feature of the Constitution, however, is more perplexing and frustrating and flummoxing both to modern Americans and to foreign observers than the method by which we elect the president. Why don't we simply allow the people to vote and permit the majority to have their selection? Why do we have this weird, eccentric, idiosyncratic institution called the Electoral College? Now, you have a sense of the broad answer to why the people do not popularly elect the president from the historical context of the Constitutional Convention. That is, the delegates, the drafters of the Constitution, are very suspicious of the judgment of the people. They think that democracy has run amok. The whole structure of the federal Constitution is a series of restraints and curbs and guardrails against the people getting their immediate choice. So the notion of an intervening body, that the people select a group who then will in turn get to select the president, makes sense in historical context. But again, the how complicated and convoluted and indeterminate the actual description here is in clauses 2 and 3 still requires further explanation. The best way to understand the language in these two clauses is to think back to the debate or the conceptual division between the modes of representation for the House of Representatives and for the Senate. That is the fundamental debate of the Constitutional Convention. What does representation represent? And as we'll see next week in Module 11, there are really three positions in that debate. One principle is that representatives represent people. Each person should have a right to equal representation. A second idea is that representation represents property, that the preservation of property is the first principle of government, and that those with property have a greater stake in the social contract by which we exchange freedom for security. And yet a third idea of representation is that the states are corporate bodies that pre-exist before the Federal Compact, so it must be the states that give their consent to the creation of any new government. Now, because the framers are contemplating a bicameral legislature, that is to say, two houses, there is a process, and we're going to watch it in Module 11, by which those three positions are really consolidated down into two. That is, effectively, personhood and property are combined in the House of Representatives, and statehood is represented in the Senate. So if you will, those two camps, even though it's really three conceptual positions, those two camps are each allowed to claim an institution for their position. There is, in the architecture of the government that they're contemplating, a way of giving each side a concession, allowing them to shape that institution according to their principles. And at the end of the day, those people who think the Senate is the right way to go about it are really suspicious of those people who advocated for the House of Representatives, and vice versa. If you are strongly committed to your belief that property is the thing that the federal government needs to protect, and so representation should be based on property, then you are deeply suspicious of a Senate where every state gets equal votes, so the poor states with less property have exactly the same voting power as the rich states with lots of property. That is a kind of affront to your democratic Republican principles. This is the deepest ideological divisions within the convention debates, and the Constitution really only happens because with the bicameral model, each side can have an institution to shape according to its values. If we come now to the choosing of the president, there is only one officer to be chosen. In other words, there is no foundation for a compromise here with the executive, and how to elect the executive was the most controversial single issue within the convention. It came up several times. The debate got heated. They would table it and move on to other topics because they didn't want to break down, the good feeling in the convention. Ultimately, the New York convention delegation walks out in protest. At one point in the debates, Hamilton remains, but he's an unofficial delegate because the state of New York has officially withdrawn its representation. And indeed, it comes up finally in the last weeks of August, in the last great issues of the convention, when they finally agree on the Electoral College model. It's the last great issue that has to be resolved. All the other things are wrapped up pretty quickly in the first weeks of September, and they're done. So this notion that it's the mode of representation is the foundational debate, and they have the most difficult time coming to a compromise when it comes to the president, because there's only one president to be chosen. So what we find in the language of Clause 2 and Clause 3 is this back and forth concession to each side, and that's the way you want to read these passages. So let's start with the second clause. It reads, each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. No senator, representative, or person holding office shall be appointed an elector. So this is a great example of the attempt to compromise. Each state gets to appoint in whatever manner the legislature may direct. So the House of Representatives model is we hold popular elections, we let the people vote. The Senate model, remember, in its original construction is the state legislature chooses the state's senators. Those are the two models presented in Article 1. What does Article 2 permit? Well, each state can make its own decision how it wants to choose its electors. So the Electoral College permits both. Now that sounds strange to us because certainly by the Jacksonian period, even earlier in the Jeffersonian period, virtually every state is holding popular elections for delegates to the Electoral College to choose the president. So very quickly, popular elections for the Electoral College becomes the norm, but that's not what the Constitution mandates. To this day, the state legislature of Michigan, for example, could simply pass a law that says, in the upcoming presidential election, the state of Michigan declares its delegates for so-and-so, and not hold an election for president in the state of Michigan. Now, of course, they would face enormous popular backlash, and that would be a very politically unpopular thing to do, but it would be constitutionally permissible under the terms of the federal Constitution. Now, how many delegates to the Electoral College does each state get to choose? The number equal to the number of senators plus the number of representatives. Now, of course, there are many more representatives, and that's on the popular basis, right? That's based on the results of the census, how many representatives each state gets. So if you do the math, adding the number of senators to the number of representatives ostensibly looks like a compromise, but it's only 2 senators no matter how big the state is. So in fact, mathematically, this grossly favors the principle of popular representation. It is on the face of it a compromise. We're just going to join the 2 formulas that we used in Article 1. We're just going to add them up. In fact, mathematically, that grossly favors the census basis of determining representation. Okay, so what are these electors going to do once we choose them? In Clause 3, the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. And they'll make a list of all the persons voted for and the number of votes for each. This list they'll sign and certify and transmit it to the seat of the government, directed to the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the President if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. And if there be more than one who have such a majority, and they have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for president. And if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the president. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. All right, so let's go back and unpack that. The electors are going to all meet separately. That is to say, all the New York electors are going to meet together. All the Massachusetts electors are going to meet together. All the Vermont electors are going to meet together. But they cannot meet together. That is, the Vermont electors can't meet with the New York electors, can't meet with the Massachusetts electors. Each state has to have its own independent caucus, and then they cast their ballots. Notice that they cast 2 votes, not 1 for president and 1 for vice president. Rather, they have to vote the first vote, anybody they want to. The second vote has to be for somebody who's not a citizen of their own state. Now, the idea there is that the New York electors are going to get together undoubtedly their motive will be to elect someone from New York who will represent their interest, right? Who will be a strong advocate for whatever New York wants. Those ballots, same thing, the people and electors in Vermont will do the same thing. The electors in Georgia will do the same thing. The electors in Maryland will do the same thing. They'll each want to try to pick somebody from their own state who will be a strong advocate for their interests. Those votes are very likely to all cancel each other out because they'll be voting for a local person. With this second vote and with the mandate to pick someone from outside their own state, they'll be forced to look at kind of national characters. People who have achieved things like George Washington led the Continental Army. Everybody from Maine to Georgia knows who George Washington is. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, etc. They would have to pick people with what Elbridge Gerry calls men of continental reputation, men of great achievements and renown. And they would be locked in by this mandate to being forced to pick someone from a different state. Out of those second ballots, which might be the kind of throwaway ballots, right? Your real goal is to get a representative from your own state or a president from your own state who will advocate for you. But with that second mandated ballot, that's where there's most likely to come a character who will get a majority all the way from Maine to Georgia. It would only be one of these guys who has a national reputation who could possibly garner that many votes. And if that happens, great. If the Electoral College succeeds in producing a majority in favor of one person, then that person definitely would have achievements of sufficient stature and renown that he would probably make a great president. When that doesn't happen, and that's the equivalent or the analog to a popular election, right? The broadest possible voting district all the way from Maine to Georgia. Even though it is the electors, it replicates that principle. If a majority is not to be found, then it gets tossed to the House of Representatives. The representatives get to choose, which is more like the Senate model, right, where the state legislature gets to pick the federal senators. If the popular vote doesn't work, then we're going to turn it over to the House of Representatives to pick. But in the House of Representatives, they're going to vote one vote per state, the voting principle of the Senate. And you can see in this back and forth the two camps within the Constitutional Convention advocating for the principles of their favorite institution. Those who are the supporters of the Senate think, oh, the electors will never be able to pick a majority. That's an impossibly large district. Once it gets tossed to the House of Representatives, then the states will get to exercise their power. And just like with the House of Representatives and with the Senate, the Electoral College no longer today operates the way in which it was originally conceived. If you recall, with the House of Representatives, the key to that formula is representatives and direct taxes will be based on the census. And with the development of the income tax, that direct taxes clause essentially becomes a dead letter of the Constitution. So too with the Senate. The original model of the Senate was the state legislature shall select, and the 16th Amendment requires then in 1913 the popular election of senators, and that original design no longer works as it was originally intended. So too with the Electoral College. You will notice here that one of the key kind of assumptions or premises of making this thing work is that the electors are essentially going in and exercising their own individual judgment. Who do I think would be the best person to be president? The bias, if there's any bias that's assumed here, it would be the electors from each state favoring their own state, and how to kind of counterbalance that bias to get a truly national choice. What is not assumed in here or not implied in here is that the electors would be representatives of political parties. And indeed, if there's one great kind of blind spot, vulnerability, or naivete about the federal Constitution, is that throughout it assumes the absence of political parties. Well, of course, very quickly after the Constitution is ratified, the American political system divides into two great rival political parties and has been dominated by political parties since the 1796 election. And what political parties do to the Electoral College model is pre-select the elector's preference. That is to say, all the electors campaign, I'm going to vote for Thomas Jefferson, vote for me, select me as an Electoral College elector because I promise you I will vote for Thomas Jefferson. Or vote for me as an elector because I promise you I will vote for John Adams. That is, the people know who the electors are supposed to be choosing based on who they gave their vote to. The electors do not meet in their respective states on election day and have a discussion among themselves. Who do we think should be president? Let's throw out some names, blah, 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 blah. The moment the election is concluded, we know exactly who each elector is committed to voting for. That changes the whole dynamic of the Electoral College model as it was originally conceived in 1787. The reason why it has persevered over 240 some years, besides the fact that it's just really difficult to change the Constitution, is that there are many more small states than there are large states, and the Electoral College gives more, outweighs their vote or gives them additional weight to their vote compared to their respective numbers. So all the North Dakotas and South Dakotas and Utahs and Nevadas and Idahos get more weight vis-a-vis states like California and Texas and New York and Florida because of those added two votes. When you add the number of representatives and the number of senators together, that +2 for the senators is the statistical advantage of the small states, and there are just many more small states than there are large states, so that makes this issue particularly difficult within our constitutional framework to imagine being remedied. We see again and again that the Electoral College produces results contrary to what the majority of voters are, but we're sort of stuck with this language that's in the Constitution. All right, so that's the executive office. The powers are described in Section 2. They are very similar to the executive powers that we saw with the state constitutions. The key difference will come back to the appointment of Supreme Court justice and the president's authority there. The key place, though, is back in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2, which reads, every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it become a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approves, he shall sign it, but if not, he shall return it with his objections to that House in which it shall have originated, who shall enter the objections while and proceed to reconsider it. This, of course, is the presidential veto clause, and we want to notice and observe how radically different this is than the Pennsylvania and New York constitutions that we looked at. If you recall there, the executive in those state constitutions had no formal role in the passage of legislation. In New York, the governor could sit on that council of revision along with the Supreme Court justices and the chancellor, but there was nothing like this formal role for the executive in a bill becoming a law. This is the great and awesome executive power. The executive here can reject the decisions of the people as determined by their representatives in Congress. This is among the most controversial, as we'll see with Melancton Smith, clauses of the federal Constitution because it seems to restore that principle of monarchy. It recalls to those who are opposed to the federal Constitution the role that King George had played in rejecting colonial legislation. And one of the great achievements of the Revolution from this point of view was to diminish the role of the one in obstructing the sovereign power of the people to have the laws that they wish to have. Now, the legislature can overcome that intervention with a 2/3 vote, but the president does not need the cooperation of any other body in order to exercise their veto authority. That is nothing like that Council of Revision that we saw in the New York and the Pennsylvania constitutions. This is a dramatic turn back from the assertion of democratic sovereignty in the Revolutionary period. All right, this class video is running a little bit long. Let's stop here, take a break, and we'll pick up with the next video with Article 3 and the description of the federal court system.